On a quiet March morning in the village of Lidcombe, the bell at St. Michael's Church rang twice before falling into eerie silence. The churchyard, hemmed in by crumbling stone walls and ancient yew trees, appeared as serene as always, with fresh dew clinging to the headstones and a faint mist curling over the grass. But that peace was shattered when the verger, Mr. George Broom, failed to open the chapel for morning prayers. When the vicar arrived shortly after and unlocked the vestry, he found the verger's body slumped against the stone steps, a jagged gash above his left ear and blood drying into the carpeted floor. Nothing seemed stolen. No doors or windows were broken. And yet, the key to the vestry had never left the church's possession. It had been hanging in its usual place in the vicar's locked cabinet. The police arrived, naturally baffled. Dr. Ashton, the local physician, placed the time of death around 5 a.m., give or take half an hour. The vicar, Reverend Puckle, was accounted for. He'd been in bed with a dreadful cold, something the entire village could confirm, having seen him coughing and wheezing through his sermon just the day before. The church's only entry points were the main door and a side entrance, both of which had been locked from within and showed no signs of tampering. Yet George Broom was dead, and not from a fall or stroke. It was most certainly murder. Even stranger was what had been left behind. Next to the body was a small object that seemed entirely out of place, a tin snuff box with a faded blue crest etched into its lid, bearing a coat of arms that nobody recognized. Inside was a fragment of paper, torn and yellowed, with a single line of Latin scrawled across it in a heavy, hurried hand: Filius neminem heredem habet. No one in the constabulary had enough Latin to interpret it on the spot, but the implication of secrecy was undeniable. The verger had never used snuff, nor did he carry any such box. Where it came from, or why it was there, was anyone's guess. Inspector Craddock was called in from Middleshire to take over the case. Though capable, even he found the affair troubling. George Broom was a mild, unremarkable man. He lived alone in a cottage owned by the parish, rarely left the village, and had few possessions. No enemies, no debts. He rarely spoke above a whisper, and had served in the same church for nearly 30 years. The discovery of such a man, murdered in a locked church with a cryptic Latin phrase in an old snuff box, offered more confusion than clarity. There were no fingerprints on the box, no trace of struggle, and nothing about the scene aligned with a robbery or common violence. In the days that followed, nothing turned up. No footprints outside, no reports of strangers in the area. The village, set apart by distance and habit, was its usual quiet self. But Lidcombe was not without its silent observers. One of them, known for her gentle inquiries and formidable memory, sat in the corner of the vicarage drawing-room too, days after the murder, pouring tea for the visiting Inspector Craddock. Miss Marple, spinster of St. Mary Mead, had come at the vicar's request, ostensibly to provide companionship to his sister-in-law during his illness, but the subtext was clear. The vicar knew a tangled thread when he saw one, and he suspected Miss Marple might tug it free. As the conversation turned toward the curious snuff-box, Miss Marple blinked gently and tilted her head. She didn't say much at first, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly at the Latin phrase. Later, she would retrieve an old notebook from her travel case, one she kept for quotations and peculiar sayings. She recognized the line, or rather, its rhythm. A priest she had known once during her wartime service had mentioned it. A son has no heir. An odd phrase to find beside a murdered verger, unless it was not meant literally. The village whispered that George had no family, but Miss Marple, ever attuned to inconsistencies, remembered otherwise. Some years ago she had attended a wedding at Lidcombe and overheard talk of George's younger brother, John Broom, who had vanished from the village in disgrace over a property dispute. No one spoke of him now. That, in Miss Marple's experience, meant something was being purposefully forgotten, and the phrase in the snuff box might suggest someone was laying claim to something or denying someone else's claim altogether. By the following afternoon, Miss Marple had asked to visit the churchyard, where she walked slowly among the gravestones. She paused near an overgrown corner behind the east wall, where several stones had been worn down by time. There, half hidden beneath ivy, was a broken headstone. Only the base remained legible. John Broome, 1902-19. The year of death was missing, incomplete. Had he died, or had the stone merely been prepared? The church records, kept meticulously by the late George Broome, showed no burial of John Broome. Miss Marple wondered, why commission a headstone if the man was not actually buried there? And if he was buried there, why no record? She made one. More call that day, this time to the antiquarian bookseller in Middleshire. She inquired not about Latin phrases, but about snuff boxes, specifically ones bearing a blue heraldic crest. An hour later, the shopkeeper called back. The crest belonged to a long-defunct family line, the Branksmeres, once minor nobility in the area, but dwindled to obscurity by the 1920s. Their last estate had been sold off after a scandal, something about forged wills and illegitimate heirs. When Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, she made only one remark to Inspector Craddock. "I believe we are dealing with something quite old, Inspector. Something that has taken years to return to the surface. The case, which had begun as a simple locked-room murder, was quickly beginning to feel like the slow unearthing of a long-buried secret. And it seemed to Miss Marple that George Broome had found something, perhaps in the church records, or perhaps buried in the very earth of the churchyard, that had made his continued silence impossible. Whatever it was, someone had killed to keep it hidden, and Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, knew that it was still there, beneath the yews, beneath the stone, waiting to be unearthed. The morning after her quiet inspection of the churchyard, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage dressed in a soft grey wool coat and hat that gave her the appearance of someone entirely harmless, which she was not. She accepted a cup of tea from the housekeeper and sat politely near the hearth as Inspector Craddock pored over the official report from the constables. The verger's pockets had been emptied at the time of discovery. Only his watch, a church key and a handkerchief remained. There had been no struggle. The snuff box was still at the station awaiting further examination, and no one could place its origin beyond Miss Marple's quiet suggestion of the Branksmere family. Craddock admitted he hadn't followed that thread yet. Too old, too vague, too tangled in folklore. He preferred facts. And yet, as he recited the report aloud, Miss Marple's fingers gently tapped the teacup in rhythm with something in her mind. "May I ask," she interrupted gently, "was the snuff-box found in his left or right hand?" Craddock paused. "His right, I believe." "Curious," she said. "He was left-handed, you know. I saw him pruning the roses outside the vestry last summer. He used his left hand for the shears, always left for the work, right for support." She sipped the tea and let her comment sit without embellishment. Craddock made a note but didn't yet see the relevance. Later that morning, the two of them walked to the church together. Craddock was not a man to discount Miss Marple entirely. He'd seen her unravel cases that had left younger men stammering. As they entered the quiet of the nave, she slowed, near the front pews, running her gloved fingers along the edge of the wooden rail. The vicar had reopened the church reluctantly. Life in Lidcombe did not pause for scandal, not even murder. Inside the vestry, the bloodstain had been scrubbed, but not forgotten. Miss Marple took in the room again. A modest desk, worn kneelers, a cabinet of robes, and shelves lined with ledgers. She knelt near the floor where the body had been found, examining the edges of the carpet. Her eyes paused at a small copper button wedged deep between the floorboards and the wall. It was almost invisible unless you were looking at the exact angle where morning sunlight hit the trim. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she pointed. "Was that catalogued, Inspector?" Craddock leaned down, surprised. "No, that's the first I've seen it." He retrieved it with tweezers. It wasn't from the verger's coat, which had all its buttons. And it wasn't old. It looked like it had come from a woman's garment, a coat, perhaps, or a glove. Miss Marple said nothing more, but the presence of that small copper button in a locked room raised a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Someone else had been there. Someone who had left no other sign but that. As they walked back toward the vicarage, they passed Mrs. Edgecombe, the widow who kept the flower rota. She was fussing with the daffodils outside the church and paused to greet them. "Terrible, isn't it?" she said with a heavy sigh. "Poor George. He never hurt a soul, though I always thought he seemed nervous when anyone mentioned the crypt." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her hand paused just a moment too long on the garden gate. "The crypt?" "Oh, yes," the woman went on. "It's sealed, of course. Hasn't been used in decades. Just old bones and dust now. George wouldn't even let me store the Harvest Festival boxes down there last year. Said it wasn't suitable." "Did he say why?" "No. Just shook his head and said it was best left alone." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "I suppose he meant the damp." But something in his voice. It made me think there was more to it. As Mrs. Edgecombe walked off with her shears, Craddock raised a brow. "You think the crypt is relevant?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that people often hide things where they believe no one will look, especially things they are not supposed to have." Craddock arranged for the crypt to be opened that same afternoon. It took 2 workmen nearly half an hour to unseal the rusted hinges and lift the iron grate that covered the narrow stairs. The air that came up was cold and smelled of mildew and age. Miss Marple did not descend. Her knees would not allow it, but she waited above while Craddock and a constable searched the crypt with torches. Several stone tombs lined the walls, their inscriptions worn and illegible, but one of them, smaller than the others and without any engraving, looked newly disturbed. The dust surrounding it had been brushed aside. The lid had fresh scrape, marks near its edge, as if someone had tried to open it and failed. Craddock ordered it moved. It would take proper tools, perhaps even a mason, but already something felt off. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her notes and read over the name again. Branksmere. She thought back to a Sunday luncheon nearly a decade ago in St. Mary Mead, when a solicitor had grumbled about an inheritance case involving a long-lost heir. Something about buried documents, forged records, a dispute over land in Berkshire. She couldn't recall the name at the time, but the family had fallen into scandal when one of their number had married beneath his station and been disinherited. She wondered if George Broome had stumbled across such a name in the old parish. Registries, perhaps a birth not properly recorded or a death faked or misdated. And if so, what did that mean for the property deeds of Lidcombe Parva, which were tied closely to historical lineage and land rights? The next morning, as the stone lid of the unmarked tomb was lifted by a team of hired men, the entire crypt fell silent. Inside, instead of a single coffin, there were 2 objects. One was a small wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, wrapped in oilcloth. The other was an iron-bound ledger, old but dry, protected by the inner stone of the tomb. Craddock opened the ledger on the spot. It was a record of burials dating back over a century, including entries that had been scratched out and rewritten. The most recent hand was unmistakably George Broome's. The last entry, dated just 1 week before his death, was a name written in careful script, John Broome, interred under protest. Miss Marple, who had remained upstairs during the discovery, looked up from her knitting when Craddock returned. "So," she said quietly, "he did come home after all." Craddock nodded grimly. "And someone didn't want it known," As she picked up a dropped stitch, Miss Marple said, "I wonder, Inspector, do we have any ladies in the village missing a copper button?" And with that, the puzzle began to reshape itself. Not just a locked room murder, but a deception buried in stone and paper, its roots tangled in family and inheritance. And somewhere in the village, someone was quietly praying that the rest would stay buried. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the lace curtains of the vicarage drawing room as Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple prepared to question the villagers most connected to the church. The discovery in the crypt had shifted the investigation's focus. It was no longer just about the murder of George Broom, but about what secrets he had unearthed, and who might have wanted them hidden forever. The small wooden box, now secured at the police station, contained old letters, faded photographs, and an unsigned legal document naming John Broom as the rightful heir to a disputed parcel of land. Land now partly under the ownership of the adjoining estate, Ashgrove Hall. Their first visitor was Mrs. Edgecombe, summoned not because she was suspected, but because she often lingered near the church and had a way of hearing things others missed. She settled into the chair with her usual nervous energy, smoothing her skirt and twisting the strap of her handbag as she spoke. "I told you already. I saw George the day before he was found. He looked pale, worried, but when I asked if he was ill, he brushed it off, said he was just tired." "Did he say what he'd been doing?" Craddock asked. "No, just that he'd been up late reading something in the records. He didn't usually bother with those unless the vicar asked him to," Miss Marple interjected gently. "Do you remember what he wore that day?" Mrs. Edgecombe blinked. "Yes, actually. His grey coat. Always wore it in the chill." "Did anyone else visit the church that afternoon?" The woman hesitated. "Well, I did see Miss Lydia from the hall. She came by, though not for long. She was dressed for riding, boots and all. Odd, really. Doesn't usually step inside." As Mrs. Edgecombe left, Craddock looked to Miss Marple, who nodded slightly. Lydia Harrington, daughter of the late Colonel Harrington and current resident of Ashgrove Hall, was next on the list. Her family's name was linked, distantly, to the Branksmere estate through a cousin's marriage nearly half a century ago. If the documents in the box were authentic, they could challenge the legitimacy of the Hall's current land holdings. When Lydia arrived at the station, she appeared perfectly composed, black riding gloves tucked under one arm, her blonde hair tied back with precision. She greeted them politely, but with a guarded air. "I understand you visited the church the day before Mr. Broom died," Craddock began. "I often do," she replied. "It's no secret. I enjoy the quiet." "Were you aware of Mr. Broom's work in the records?" She tilted her head slightly. "He mentioned once that he liked old things. I assumed he meant gravestones." "And what about your family's connection to the Branksmeres?" "I've heard the stories," she said coolly. "But they're just that, stories. Ghosts and gossip." Miss Marple, who had remained quiet, leaned forward slightly. "And yet your father was quite interested in the land records before his passing, wasn't he?" Lydia didn't answer immediately. Her expression held, but her eyes shifted ever so briefly. "He was fond of history. That doesn't make me a murderer." "No one's suggesting that," Craddock said, making a note. "But we'd appreciate your cooperation while we examine the documents Mr. Broom may have uncovered." As Lydia left, her pace quickened slightly, though her posture remained upright. Miss Marple watched her go, and then remarked softly, "Too poised. I always find such calmness unsettling when someone's inheritance might be in question." Their next conversation was with Thomas Pritchard, the church's part-time groundskeeper. A broad-shouldered man with weather-beaten skin, he'd worked under George Broom for over a decade. He sat stiffly across from them, cap in hand. "Mr. Pritchard, we understand you had access to the vestry keys," Craddock said. "Only when George gave them to me, sir," he replied quickly. "Last Time was 3 weeks ago. Had to oil the hinges. Did you know about the crypt being disturbed? No, sir, I'd never go down there. Don't care for the smell. Did George seem anxious recently? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Well, now you mention it, he did ask me about getting the ledger cabinet fixed. Said the lock wasn't quite right. I said I'd see to it, but he told me to leave it be. Said he'd changed his mind. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Did he say why? Didn't, but he looked like he regretted something. Craddock jotted that down and nodded him out. As the door closed, Miss Marple observed, "It's not always what they say, it's what they say too easily. He wanted us to believe he never entered the crypt, said it before we even asked." Craddock sighed. Too many threads, not enough. Knots. Later that evening they spoke to one last person, Agnes Tyler, the maid who occasionally cleaned the vicarage and who had also worked part-time at Ashgrove Hall. She arrived flustered, her fingers fidgeting with her sleeves. Her nervousness was palpable. "I didn't mean no harm," she began before they even questioned her. Miss Marple offered her a calm smile. "No one thinks you did, my dear. But it's very important we understand what happened. Did you see anyone near the church late that evening? I went by to leave some flowers I'd forgotten. It was just past sunset. I saw someone coming from the vestry. A woman, I think, though she had a scarf pulled up and her coat tight. Could you tell who it was?" Agnes hesitated, then whispered, "I thought it might be Miss Lydia. She walks like her, but I didn't want to say nothing." "Why not?" "Because the next morning I found a glove in the hallway at the hall, a riding glove. The left one. Miss Lydia said she'd lost it, but it had a copper button, just like the one you found." Craddock leaned forward. "And where is that glove now?" "She took it, said it wasn't important." As Agnes left, pale and shaken, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "It's lining up, isn't it? Lydia's glove, her visit, the missing records." But Miss Marple held up her hand. "Almost. But there's something not quite right. If she truly killed him to protect her inheritance, why leave the box hidden in the crypt? Why not destroy it?" Craddock frowned. "Because maybe she didn't know it was there. Or," Miss Marple said quietly, "maybe someone wanted her to seem like she did." And just like that, the angle shifted. What had seemed like a straightforward motive began to unravel again. Someone was pulling strings, carefully crafting a trail of guilt. But the threads were beginning to fray, and Miss Marple, with her needlepoint precision, was watching every stitch. Inspector Craddock spent the next morning reviewing every statement, every detail, every glance that hadn't quite matched the words spoken. In another case, Lydia Harrington might have been arrested already. Her missing glove, her presence at the church, her family's precarious link to the Branksmere estate. All of it fit too well. But as Miss Marple had pointed out, the neatness of it all was precisely the problem. It was too convenient, too controlled, as if someone wanted Lydia to stand at the center of the storm while they slipped away through the shadows. The inspector sat across from Miss Marple in the vicarage drawing room, both quiet in their own thoughts as the clock ticked away the hour. Miss Marple finally looked up from her knitting, eyes sharp. "There's a pattern here, Inspector, but it's being deliberately smudged. Everyone we've spoken to seems to be reacting not with shock, but with a sort of weary caution, as though they've all known something was festering beneath the surface for some time." Craddock nodded. "Too many of them knew about the crypt, and yet no one admits to opening it. Or perhaps they didn't open it, but knew or feared what it might contain. Together they laid out the list. Lydia Harrington, a plausible heir threatened by George's discovery. Thomas Pritchard, loyal to George but with unusual knowledge of the faulty cabinet and a curious eagerness to deny involvement. Agnes Tyler, frightened, observant, and perhaps more entangled with the Hall than she let on. And then there was Reverend Puckle, absent from scrutiny thus far due to his illness, but custodian of the church keys and overseer of the records George had been poring over. Later that day, Craddock paid a quiet visit to the Reverend, whose cough had lessened enough for him to sit up with tea and scones. He answered every question plainly, but when asked about the cabinet, his brow furrowed. "I did have a conversation with George, about a month ago, I think. He mentioned discrepancies in the burial ledgers. I told him to make note of anything troubling. He didn't bring it up again." "Did he say what the discrepancies were?" "No, only that some names didn't align with the family plots. He seemed agitated, but not alarmed." "Did he mention the Branksmere name?" The vicar's fingers paused on his teacup. Yes, now that you say it, he did. Said it was turning up more than it should in the early records. And yet you didn't follow up." I suppose I thought it was one of his little hobbies. George could be obsessive. He cared deeply for the church's history. As Craddock made his way back to the station, he mulled over the Reverend's subtle hesitation. George had clearly confided in him. Why had the vicar done nothing? And why hadn't he warned George of the potential danger, if indeed someone else stood to lose something significant? Meanwhile, Miss Marple had made her way to Ashgrove Hall, not to confront Lydia, but to speak with someone who rarely factored into village gossip, the housekeeper, Mrs. Vale. She had served the Harringtons for 3 decades and had seen everything, from war rationing to funeral preparations, without ever drawing attention. When Miss Marple asked politely about Lydia's behaviour in recent weeks, Mrs. Vale sighed. "She's been under pressure. Lawyers writing, estate matters piling up. She's trying to keep it all together. But truth be told, I think she's afraid." "Afraid of what?" Mrs. Vale hesitated. "Of being forced to sell. If those letters in the box prove the land doesn't rightfully belong to her, the rest of the estate's claim could fall apart. The debts are worse than most people know." "Does anyone else know about the box?" Miss Marple asked. "Only what I heard in passing." She was talking to someone. In the hall late one evening, 2 nights before the verger died, a man's voice, deep. Not the inspector, not Thomas Pritchard. "Did you see him?" "No, but I'd know the tone. Calculating, not village-born." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back, her mind knitting together the threads. Lydia, it seemed, had spoken with someone who didn't belong, a man determined to keep the contents of that crypt from surfacing. But who? And why use Lydia's glove, if not to shift suspicion, unless Lydia was being used? Back at the station, Craddock summoned Thomas Pritchard for a second interview. This time, he pressed harder. "You said George cancelled your repairs to the cabinet. That was just before he died." "Aye. Did you see him that night?" "No, sir." "Where were you?" "At home, with my sister." Craddock paused. "Your sister died last autumn, didn't she?" Thomas blinked. A beat passed. I meant my cousin. She visits sometimes." Craddock stared at him evenly. "You understand the seriousness of this, Mr. Pritchard?" Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't hurt him, I swear it, but I did go to the church. I saw the vestry light on and thought maybe he was still working. But I left when I heard voices inside, arguing." "Did you recognize them?" "One was George, the other, I think it was someone from the hall, not Lydia, a man." Craddock dismissed him, mind racing. A man from the hall, a missing glove, a staged clue. It was a performance, each piece planted to shape suspicion. George had stumbled onto something real, an inheritance fraud perhaps, or a falsified deed, and someone had panicked. That evening, Miss Marple stood at the window watching the sky dim over the churchyard. She turned to Craddock as he entered. "There's something cruel in how tidy it all looks," she said softly. "Like a house that's been swept too thoroughly." He nodded. "I think Lydia's being framed," Miss Marple agreed. Someone knew exactly how the village would talk about her gloves, her presence, her family's entitlement. They knew she'd be the perfect distraction. Craddock ran a hand down his face. "But who?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the trees. Behind the church, someone who understood that hiding a truth is easier when you place a visible lie in front of it. As the bells began to chime for evening service, both knew the motive had taken shape, but the identity of the puppeteer remained hidden. They had the pieces now: land, legitimacy, and a family secret someone was desperate to keep buried. But which hand had struck George Broom down to keep it that way? That was the final knot they had to untie. Rain had begun to fall steadily by the next morning, softening the ground in the churchyard and dulling the usual village chatter to a hush. Inside the police station, Inspector Craddock stood before a table on which the copper-buttoned glove now lay sealed in a plastic envelope. Alongside it were photographs of the wooden box from the crypt, the burial ledger, and a formal letter that had arrived early that morning from a solicitor in London, confirming, with finality, that the legal documents inside the box were genuine. John Broom, long presumed missing or dead, had indeed been the rightful heir to a key parcel of land that was now under the control of the Harrington estate. The implications were vast. If the land had changed hands unlawfully, then the inheritance that Lydia Harrington believed secure could be rendered null. It was this letter, coupled with the damning evidence of the glove and Pritchard's testimony, placing Lydia near the vestry, that spurred Craddock's superiors into action. By noon, a warrant had been drafted and a car sent to Ashgrove Hall. Lydia Harrington was brought in quietly, her expression unreadable, her voice calm as she answered questions without flinching. She did not deny visiting the church. She admitted the glove was hers. But she insisted, again and again, that she had never entered the vestry that night, never spoke with George Broom, and never knew what the crypt contained until she was told afterward. To the wider public, it looked like resolution. The daughter of a fading aristocracy, exposed as the potential killer of a church verger to keep her family's holdings intact. It was almost theatrical. Newspapers would love it. The inspector from Middleshire, brought in to assist, even suggested holding a press statement. But Craddock, for all the official relief surrounding him, remained uneasy. He found himself standing once more at the edge of the churchyard that evening, rain soaking into his coat, eyes fixed on the vestry door. Something was off. The timeline, the simplicity, it all felt too engineered. He wasn't alone in his doubts. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with her notebook open, cross-referencing the burial entries with a list she had compiled of local families and the names that had once been associated with the parish's trust deeds. Her pencil hovered above a particular name, Edgar Vale. The name had appeared in the ledgers twice in the 1930s, once again in 1944, and most peculiarly had been struck out and replaced in the most recent handwriting, George Broom's. Edgar Vale, as she now recalled, was the older brother of the current housekeeper at Ashgrove Hall. That in itself meant little. But a memory returned to her, an overheard remark years ago at a harvest supper about how the Vale family had once been stewards for the Branksmeres. She rose, set her knitting aside, and went to fetch her coat. By the time she arrived at Ashgrove Hall, the staff had dispersed. Mrs. Vale was alone in the kitchen, preparing a modest supper, her eyes tired. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but purposeful. "Tell me, my dear, when your brother left the hall, what did he leave behind?" Mrs. Vale turned, startled. "Why do you ask?" "Because Edgar Vale's name was written and erased 3 times in the church records, and I think George Broom found something he wasn't meant to." The housekeeper stared at her for a long moment before lowering herself into a chair. "He found the letter," she said finally. "The one my brother hid. A confession of sorts. Edgar wasn't just a steward. He was John Broom's friend. The only one who knew John had come back to the village under a different name." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Different name?" "Yes. John changed his name when he returned quietly. He didn't want the Harringtons to know he'd survived the war. He'd been declared missing, and by the time he came back, his land was already under their care. So he took work through Edgar, lived quietly, and when he died, Edgar buried him, without a word to the authorities. Miss Marple listened carefully, and George discovered this in the records. Recently, Edgar left the letter with me before he passed. I told George when he asked about odd entries I thought he would help clear it up, but I never imagined. She trailed off. You gave him the letter. I did. I trusted him. He said he'd speak with the diocese before saying anything. Miss Marple stood. I believe you, but someone else didn't trust him to stay quiet. Back at the station, Craddock was drafting a statement when Miss Marple arrived. She laid the name down on his desk. John Broome, alias Arthur Kemp. The revelation hit like a bolt. Arthur Kemp had been a church gardener in the 1960s, died quietly. No family, no record of his origins. Buried under a simple stone. And who would have known about the alias? Craddock asked. Someone close to both the hall and the church. Someone who'd handled the records, perhaps even copied them. Someone who saw George getting too close. Craddock sat back. Mrs. Vale? She only passed the letter on. But think, Inspector, who else has touched the records? Who knew the crypt had once been sealed with documents inside? And who had reason to keep Lydia Harrington from inheriting everything? Craddock's eyes narrowed. Thomas Pritchard. He's been close to the hall for years. Knew the estate's finances were hanging by a thread. Knew George had begun talking. And planted the glove. It wasn't Lydia's. The button was from an older set of gloves, not the kind she wears now. Craddock stood without a word and sent for Pritchard. The man arrived soon after, confused but steady. Craddock didn't accuse him outright. Instead, he asked him to describe once again the events of that night. And this time, Miss Marple was present, watching closely. When Pritchard mentioned seeing a woman's shadow pass by the vestry, Miss Marple leaned forward. "Forgive me," she said, "but how would you see a shadow if the interior light was off?" Pritchard hesitated. It was dim, maybe just the moon. But it rained that night, Craddock said. Heavy cloud cover, no moonlight, and the vestry's windows are frosted. The silence hung. Pritchard's hands twitched. Then he looked up, eyes hard. He would have ruined her. Lydia's not like her father. She was going to sell the land, let the village farm it again. George wanted scandal, history. I tried to reason with him. And when he wouldn't stop, Craddock asked. Pritchard's voice dropped. I only meant to scare him, but he shoved the ledger at me, said he'd go public. I lost my temper. Craddock exhaled, the weight of the false victory lifting from his shoulders. Lydia Harrington had not killed George Broome. But the man who had stood quietly at her side for years had done it to protect her future. And in doing so had nearly destroyed it. As Pritchard was led away, Miss Marple returned to her chair at the vicarage and resumed her knitting. Such a tangle, she murmured. All that effort and the truth still slipped through. She glanced out the window toward the churchyard, now drenched in rain. Secrets never stay buried, not forever. The confession from Thomas Pritchard settled like dust after a long storm, visible, weighty, but not yet entirely still. For the police, it marked resolution. The files began to close, forms were submitted, and Lydia Harrington's name was quietly cleared without the fanfare that had accompanied her earlier arrest. Yet despite the relief that rippled through the village, Miss Marple did not feel at ease. There was something unsatisfying about the whole affair. Not in the facts, those were tidy enough, but in the feeling. Motives explained certain actions, yes, but they did not account for the tone of fear that had hung around George Broome in those final days, nor did they fully explain the decision to hide the wooden box in the crypt rather than destroy it. George had uncovered something more than just a disputed land claim, something that had frightened him. Miss Marple requested access to the church's old parish bulletins, which were kept in a battered file cabinet at the back of the vicarage. With the vicar's quiet approval, she began leafing through the yellowed sheets, looking for anything that might tie the past more tightly to the present. It was in a newsletter from April 1947 that she found a small obituary notice. Mr. Arthur Kemp, longtime gardener to the late Branksmere family, interred with private ceremony. It was the name, not the words, that held her still. Arthur Kemp, the alias John Broome had used. George had suspected, then confirmed, that John had returned to the village under that name. But why such secrecy at the time of death? She copied the notice and returned to the station, where Inspector Craddock, still reeling slightly from how neatly Pritchard's confession had fit together, read it over with fresh interest. If this was John Broome, why the alias and, more importantly, who arranged a private burial without notifying the parish? "I suspect someone who wished to bury more than a man," Miss Marple said. It was easier to hide an identity than to challenge an estate transfer already in motion. But there's more, Inspector. The Branksmere family didn't just vanish, they disintegrated. There was a scandal in the late 30s involving missing funds from the diocesan trust. Craddock raised his brow. "You think the two are connected?" "I think George did. I think he discovered not just that John Broome had returned, but that his disappearance and the Branksmere collapse were tied by someone's hand, someone who used Arthur Kemp as a way to bury both the truth and the heir." Intrigued, Craddock dug further, requesting archived legal records from the diocese. Days passed before the files arrived, and when they did, they revealed something startling. In 1936, a Branksmere trustee named Bernard Vale had been quietly removed from the board for financial irregularities. The name echoed through the room. Vale. The same family name as the housekeeper at Ashgrove Hall. And more disturbingly, the same family that had buried John Broome under the false name of Arthur Kemp. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her lap. Edgar Vale didn't just help John Broome. He was likely the last loyal friend he had. But Bernard Vale, that's a different matter entirely. Craddock nodded slowly. If Bernard orchestrated the cover-up, it might explain why the Branksmere assets were stripped, why John vanished, and why the Harringtons stepped in. If George Broome uncovered that Bernard Vale had embezzled the trust and eliminated the rightful heir with a false burial, that would have upended everything. But that would make George's death far more than a panicked act of loyalty, Miss Marple said. It would make it a deliberate silencing. Craddock frowned. But Pritchard confessed. Because he struck George, yes. But I believe George was already being watched. Pritchard acted impulsively. Someone else ensured the box was left untouched, the glove was found, and the body discovered in a way that pointed suspicion outward. Craddock leaned back in his chair, thinking. That means there's someone else. Someone older, perhaps, tied to both eras. Someone who knew what happened in the 30s, and who feared George would bring it all into the light. They returned. To the hall, not for Lydia, but for Mrs. Vale. She received them in the small sitting room off the kitchen, her hands clasped in her lap. When Craddock mentioned Bernard Vale's name, her eyes flickered. "My uncle," she said. "But he died." "Long ago. Did he speak of the Branksmeres, of the trust?" "He rarely spoke of anything," she said. "Only that the past was better left alone." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Your brother Edgar tried to set it right, didn't he? By helping John Broome. But he was watched. And when George began asking questions, he was warned." Mrs. Vale said nothing. Craddock spoke next, his voice calm. "There's no crime in protecting a memory, but there is one in letting another man take the fall. If you know who is behind the ledger changes, the burial fraud, we need their name." Her eyes filled with quiet dread. "You'll find nothing. The one who arranged it all, he's already gone. Died 10 years ago, but I kept his letters. I didn't destroy them. Edgar made me promise. They're upstairs." Later, in the inspector's hands, those letters spilled their secrets. Bernard Vale had manipulated the transfer of assets when the Branksmere heir was declared missing. He had redirected funds through a shell trust and arranged for Arthur Kemp, John Broome, to remain invisible. When John tried to come forward, Bernard had him quietly buried, then forged the parish records to keep him erased. And Edgar, torn by guilt but unable to confront his uncle, had lived with the secret for decades. Miss Marple read each line with a grim mouth. George must have found the same trail, the burial record, the missing funds, and someone, perhaps not Bernard, but someone who had inherited the shame, panicked. The final piece arrived when Agnes Tyler, the maid, returned with news of her own. She'd been cleaning out an old drawer in the hall storage room and found a torn envelope addressed to George Broome. Inside was half a letter, unsigned, warning him to stop pursuing the past, lest it consume the present. It had never been sent. Agnes had meant to burn it, afraid it might mean trouble. But after hearing what had come to light, she brought it in. Miss Marple held it carefully. The paper was decades old. The handwriting was tight, controlled. Not Bernard Vale's, perhaps someone else from the trust, or even a distant legal associate still guarding a legacy of lies. The roots ran deep, not just through money or property, but through pride, silence, and a long chain of people who had convinced themselves the truth was best forgotten. Standing once more in the churchyard as the rain let up and the evening sun began to warm the stones, Miss Marple looked down at the modest grave of Arthur Kemp. "He came back," she said softly, "and he died again, in name. But now he may finally be allowed to rest." Craddock joined her. "And George?" "He died for truth," she replied. "But not in vain. The shadows are long in this village, Inspector, but even shadows eventually shorten, when the light is held steady long enough." The next morning, the village awoke beneath a heavy grey sky, the clouds low and still, as if the very air were holding its breath. Though Pritchard remained in custody and the Vale family's letters had shed light on the old scandal, Miss Marple remained restless. Something essential was missing. One final confirmation that would close the circle. There was no doubt now that John Broome had returned under the name Arthur Kemp, and that Bernard Vale had buried more than a man. But the actual handling of the fraudulent records, the hidden documents in the crypt, and especially the precise timing of George Broome's death, still whispered of one more hand, someone who had not merely inherited a secret, but had acted to preserve it. Over tea in the vicarage, Miss Marple proposed an idea to Inspector Craddock. It was, she admitted, unconventional. "We have facts, but no truth," she said quietly. "Not yet. There's a difference, you know." Craddock, though sceptical, had learned better than to dismiss her instincts. "What do you have in mind?" "A conversation," she said, "with Lydia Harrington. But not about the murder, about the land." Craddock frowned. "You think she knows more than she said?" "I think she's been made to believe she knows less." That afternoon, under the guise of settling an estate inquiry, Miss Marple invited Lydia for tea in the church hall. It was an informal setting, almost domestic, with scones, jam, and strong Darjeeling, all laid out with a kind of calculated innocence. Lydia arrived guarded, but curious. The air between them was soft at first, filled with pleasantries, but as the plates emptied, Miss Marple's tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. "My dear, you know you were never truly under suspicion, don't you?" she said, her voice gentle but precise. "The glove was placed, and not even a modern pair. It was meant to look like yours, but it wasn't. Someone assumed you wouldn't know the difference. Lydia sat straighter, her expression unreadable. So you've found who did it? Almost. But what I truly need is to understand who frightened George Broome in the first place. He told no one, not even the vicar. Yet he hid that box in the crypt, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed, and placed beneath the tombstone of a man no one would visit. Lydia hesitated. He told me once, years ago, that the past didn't stay buried long in Lidcombe. Wise words, Miss Marple said. Then she tilted her head slightly. Tell me, if you'd been given a chance to sell the disputed land before this all began, say a private offer, quiet and generous, would you have accepted? Lydia blinked. That's an odd question, but yes, probably. The estate needs funds. I've been considering it for months. Did you receive such an offer? Her lips parted, but then she paused. I did get a letter. Weeks ago. Anonymous. It said someone wanted to buy the woodland bordering the old Branksmere line. No names, just a price. Did George know? I told him in passing. He didn't say much. Just that it wasn't mine to sell until I knew everything. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and removed a folded page, one of the old trust documents recovered from the crypt. It was dated March 1935 and bore a stamped signature, C.R. Davies. She laid it on the table, letting Lydia's eyes linger. That name means nothing to me, Lydia said. It didn't to me either, Miss Marple replied, but the vicar found an old parish committee list. C.R. Davies served alongside Bernard Vale, a solicitor not local but used often in land matters. Now here's the interesting thing. That letter you received, would you be so kind as to let me see it again? Lydia hesitated, then withdrew it from her handbag. Miss Marple opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a typed page, bland, in tone professionally worded. She pointed to the faint watermark in the upper corner. Davies and Harrow, solicitors, Cheltenham. Craddock, who had quietly entered through the back and stood listening unseen, stepped forward now. Davies and Harrow was dissolved in 1972. The paper is old, used deliberately. This letter wasn't from a firm. It was made to look like it was. Miss Marple nodded. Someone who had access to the old records. Someone who knew the paper, the names, and the property lines. Someone who wanted Lydia to sell the land before George exposed the truth. Craddock narrowed his eyes. But who? Miss Marple glanced at Lydia. Do you recall the handwriting on the envelope? Lydia thought for a moment. Actually, yes. It was oddly stiff, almost like someone not used to cursive. Miss Marple stood. Which is why I've taken the liberty of inviting a guest, someone who used to type reports but always struggled with longhand. The church hall door opened. Agnes Tyler stepped in, wringing her hands. Her eyes darted between them all. Miss Marple said I should come. Agnes, Craddock said, his voice calm, we're not accusing you, but we believe you've been manipulated. Agnes looked confused. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled gently. You worked at Ashgrove Hall for years. You saw the documents, the letters. Someone close to you, perhaps a relative, used your trust to plant the letter. Did you mail it yourself? Agnes hesitated. I was told it was just business, that Miss Lydia would want to see it quickly. I was handed the envelope, told to leave it on the hall table. Who told you? Craddock asked. She paused, eyes brimming. It was Mr. Henley, the estate accountant. He's the one who always manages the land files. Said it was private, nothing to do with the murder. Miss Marple's eyes flashed. Mr. Henley, of course, quiet, helpful, unremarkable. He's handled estate records for both the Branksmeres and the Harringtons. He would have known about the forged signatures, the gaps. In the trust, Craddock stood. And he'd know that if Lydia discovered the truth and claimed the land properly, his own position, built on years of silence, would collapse. So he tried to nudge her into selling. When George got too close, he used Pritchard's outburst to muddy the waters and stayed hidden. That evening, Craddock returned to the hall to question Mr. Henley. The man was courteous, but when shown the watermark and asked about the ledger for 1935, his composure faltered. When asked about C.R. Davies, he made the mistake of claiming ignorance, only to be shown his own signature on a 1987 estate review referencing Davies as a former contact. The crack was visible. Not loud, not dramatic, but there. And Miss Marple, who watched it unfold from the corner of the room, saw all she needed in the way Henley reached to adjust his glasses with a trembling hand. The deception had finally split. Open not by force but by miscalculation, one man's belief that history could be shaped quietly from behind the curtain. But the past had too many witnesses, too many faint trails. And Miss Marple had followed each of them thread by thread into the heart of a truth he could no longer escape. The morning after Henley's calm exterior had begun to unravel under Inspector Craddock's quiet pressure, the investigation seemed on the brink of full exposure. The estate accountant hadn't confessed, not outright, but cracks in his memory, contradictions in dates, and that single tremor in his hand told Miss Marple all she needed. They were finally close. Close to untangling the last root of a crime born decades earlier. Craddock had planned to return that afternoon with a warrant to search the hall's document room. Henley, though not officially detained, had been asked to remain available and was, for the moment, compliant. The final ledger, the one George Broome had most recently handled, was still at the police station, alongside the envelope from the crypt and the copy of the false land proposal that had drawn suspicion. But by midday, everything changed. Sergeant Blake was the first to notice. He had gone to retrieve the sealed materials from the evidence room, a locked storage cabinet in the back of the station, for review ahead of the magistrate's approval. The door was unlocked, not forced, not broken, simply unlocked. And, inside, two things were missing: the original burial ledger and the envelope bearing C.R. Davies's signature. Nothing else had been touched. The file drawer remained otherwise undisturbed, but the key items, the ones that tied the past to the present, the ledgers George Broome had risked his life to protect, were gone. Craddock's fury was quiet but immediate. He checked every name logged on the duty roster. No one outside official staff had entered the room, no sign of forced entry, but someone had known where the ledger was, known its value, and known when to act. An inside job, or someone who had convinced an insider to look the other way. Miss Marple, when told of the theft, didn't react with surprise. Her response was sharper, quieter. "Of course," she said. He wouldn't allow the trail to reach court. Not if it meant admitting. How many decades he profited from that silence. Craddock stood by the window, arms folded. Henley. He knew George was getting close. He set Lydia up to take the fall. And when Pritchard confessed, he let it play out, until the evidence pointed toward him. Now, with the ledger gone, he's hoping it all collapses under doubt. Craddock. Paste. Without the ledger or the Davies envelope, we have no physical link between George's findings and the original fraud. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Which is why we must do what George did. Work with what remains. That evening, the churchyard took on a different weight. Miss Marple, wrapped in a shawl, walked the perimeter slowly. Not to mourn, but to remember. She retraced George's steps in her mind, how he would have hidden the box, why he'd chosen the crypt. There had been desperation, yes, but also intention. He knew he was being watched. That meant he had planned for the possibility of interception, and if so, he might have left something elsewhere, something only the observant would find. It was Agnes Tyler who helped, though she didn't know it at the time. She had been helping the vicar clean the old candle store when she mentioned a small metal case tucked into the back of a cupboard behind a dusty row of hymnals. "I didn't think it mattered," she said. "It's just papers, I think. No name on it." Miss Marple's hands were steady as she opened it an hour later at the vicarage. Inside, wrapped in waxed linen and marked only with a faint pencil, scrawl, for Lydia if needed, was a second set of notes in George Broom's careful hand. He had copied portions of the burial ledger, including the entries relating to Arthur Kemp, the Brank smears, and the land boundary shifts following the war. A copy, not as strong as the original, but enough to show pattern, intent, and design. Enough to prove knowledge. Craddock reviewed the papers carefully, then locked them away in a separate safe under direct supervision. But the discovery came too late for comfort. That night, the station's back window was found cracked. An attempted entry, though not successful. The tension in Lidcombe Parva thickened. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. Each constable's movements were questioned, visitors logged, rechecked, and Henley vanished. When officers arrived to escort him for further questioning, his cottage at the edge of the Hall's property was empty. His few possessions remained, clothes, ledgers, old files, but the man himself was gone. Miss Marple sat that evening with her hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. "He knew we were closing. In," she said, "and he destroyed what he couldn't control. But flight is its own confession. He's running because there's more." Craddock glanced up. "More than land?" She nodded. "More than money. George died not just for truth, but for someone else's protection. Henley didn't just fear exposure, he feared someone else would talk, and I think they still might." The remaining question wasn't just who had stolen the evidence, but who Henley had feared most. Someone he worked for, or someone he betrayed. Someone who might not let him disappear so quietly, because now the balance had shifted. The evidence was fragile. The truth had been partly burned. And everyone still standing near the fire could feel the heat rising. Miss Marple's gaze turned once again to the church, not as sanctuary now, but as battleground. George Broom had left behind his map, and now the final steps of the journey had to be taken. But with one player vanished, and another perhaps still in the shadows, the last revelation would require more than proof. It would require pressure, and the next move, Miss Marple knew, would not be hers. It would come from whoever had the most to lose when the truth finally reached daylight. The next day began under brittle sunlight, cold and pale, as if even the weather sensed something fractured beneath the surface of Lidcombe Parva. With Henley's disappearance still unresolved and the critical evidence stolen from the station, Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple had shifted their focus to preserving what remained: George Broom's handwritten copies, Agnes Tyler's testimony, and the lingering web of financial links between the Branksmere Trust and the estate accountant's quiet manipulations. But they were not moving fast enough. Just past 10 o'clock, a sharp knock broke the calm of the vicarage. It was Sergeant Blake, his uniform damp from haste. He spoke quickly. There had been an incident at the Hall. Not Henley, not Lydia. It was Mrs. Vale. They arrived to find her body at the foot of the back stairs, where the service wing met the cellar door. She was still dressed for the morning, apron tied, spectacles pushed askew. The cause appeared simple: a fall, a broken neck, perhaps an accident. But the look on her face was not one of surprise. It was frozen terror. The doctor would later say her injuries were inconsistent with a mere stumble. There were bruises around her wrists, defensive marks. She had struggled, and she had lost. Craddock stepped back from the body as it was lifted. "He's silencing them, anyone who can tie him to the records." Miss Marple stood nearby, unmoving, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "He's not silencing them. He's silencing her." Craddock turned. "What do you mean?" She knew something Henley didn't want known, she said, still staring at the empty steps. Something she hadn't yet told us, and now it's lost. Again. They combed her quarters thoroughly. Among her belongings was a locked drawer, in her dresser, opened with a small brass key tucked in her sewing basket. Inside were a few old photographs and a stack of letters bound in twine. The oldest were from her brother Edgar, the rest from someone else. C.R. Davies, the same solicitor, whose name had appeared on the stolen document. Miss Marple sat slowly as she read the earliest letter. It was dated 1948, and in its brittle pages she found a conversation that stretched back decades. Davies had known about Arthur Kemp. He had visited Lidcombe Parva secretly, helped arrange the burial, and most critically, expressed doubt in his own notes. He had questioned Bernard Vale's honesty, hinted at pressures from the diocese, and written of his intent to retain personal copies in the event of review. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly. He kept records, not just the original, but duplicates. Craddock leaned in. Then Henley's theft wasn't enough. He needed to find those too, and he believed Mrs. Vale had them. But she didn't, Miss Marple said quietly. She only had the letters. The documents, if they exist, are still out there. They left the hall, but the mood had changed. This was no longer a slow unraveling of the past. This was active resistance. Someone wasn't waiting for the truth to be revealed. They were hunting it down, eliminating anything that threatened their control. Henley, missing. Mrs. Vale silenced. The ledger gone. It was a war now, not a puzzle. That evening, as rain began to fall again in dull sheets, Miss Marple returned alone to the church. She had asked Craddock for a few hours without escort. There was something she needed to test, not with evidence, but with instinct. She walked through the nave, paused by the altar, and moved to the vestry, the same room where George had died. She knelt near the cabinet where the parish records were once kept and stared at the freshly repaired floorboard beneath it. She had been turning over one detail again and again. If George had hidden the box in the crypt, why had he returned to the vestry? He must have believed something remained, something he'd missed. Her fingers traced the moulding along the edge. Dust shifted slightly. She pressed gently, and a loose panel clicked inward. Behind it, wedged between wall and plaster, was a narrow tube wrapped in waxed paper. Miss Marple's hands were careful as she lifted it. Inside, tightly rolled and still dry, were 5 folded documents. 2 were financial ledgers, 1 was a list of payments, and the last 2 were signed statements, one from Edgar Vale, the other from George Broome. The final page was dated a week before George's death. She stood, breathing slowly, and turned to leave the church. But the vestry door was no longer open. She heard the bolt slide shut from the other side. There was a pause, a long one. Then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps receding into the nave. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. No fear, only calculation. Whoever it was hadn't spoken, but they had waited, followed. And now they were walking away, believing the door would be enough. She waited in silence for 5 minutes, then carefully removed a match from her handbag and struck it. In the light she found the fire lamp on the far wall and lit it. Its warm glow filled the small chamber, steady and soft. When Craddock arrived an hour later, alerted by the vicar who had seen a shadow lingering by the church's side entrance, he found the door locked, but the window open. Miss Marple stood in the grass beyond, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, holding the wax tube in both hands. "He was there," she said quietly. "He followed me. He didn't speak, but he wanted me gone." Craddock took the documents from her and opened them in the parish hall. As he read, his face changed. The ledgers were real. The payments traced back to a shadow account tied to the Branksmere estate's liquidation. an account Henley had controlled. And the statements? One was Edgar's full confession about the burial of John Broome. The other, George's final letter, naming Henley directly and urging that the records be protected. He's still watching us, Craddock said. Still one step ahead, Miss Marple nodded. But now he knows he's losing, and the more desperate he becomes, the more visible he'll be. We need to move faster. The chase was no longer quiet, no longer cautious. The truth had come. Up from the crypts, from the floorboards, from letters buried in drawers. But the villain had not stopped. He had simply changed the rules. Now, Miss Marple knew, it would not be enough to reveal him. They would have to catch him in the act before another body turned up, silent and too late. The wind had picked up by morning, pushing through the village with a cold insistence, stirring loose shutters and rattling hedgerows. Inside the station, Inspector Craddock stood over a table cluttered with maps, copied ledgers, and George Broome's final letter. Miss Marple sat nearby, knitting untouched in her lap, her gaze resting on a single name underlined 3 times in the list of financial transactions. H.B. Ledgerwell. A shell company now confirmed, used to launder Branksmere Trust assets into private pockets. Henley's pockets. But as damning as it was, it didn't explain the precision with which each obstacle in the investigation had been timed. Henley had vanished before the net closed. Mrs. Vale had died within hours of being discovered as a witness. The stolen ledger had been removed minutes before the review, all of it too fast, too well coordinated for one man working alone. Miss Marple spoke without turning her head. Henley was clever, yes, but not clever enough to manage this from the shadows without help. He was running scared. I think he took orders more than he gave them. Craddock turned. You think there's someone else pulling the strings? I think, she said slowly, that someone expected George to find the crypt. Someone who used Henley to carry out the cleaning, but stayed in the background. And now that George's backup plan has surfaced, they've stepped forward. Craddock paced. So we ask again, who gains the most from keeping the Branksmere line erased? From silencing John Broome's return, and from hiding those records for 70 years? Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, her eyes followed a gust of wind, lifting a page from the table and blowing it across the floor. Craddock bent to retrieve it, then froze. It wasn't one of the reports. It was a photo, tucked between folders, one of the ones recovered from the crypt box. Faded, curling at the corners. 3 men standing in front of the old Branksmere hunting lodge, hands clasped behind their backs. One of them was John Broome, younger but unmistakable. The other 2 were unfamiliar to Craddock, but not to Miss Marple. She rose, took the photo, and studied the man on the left. Heavy-set dark coat, eyes slightly averted. That's Bernard Vale, she said. I remember him at a harvest auction when I was quite young. Always wore 2 tight gloves. She moved her finger to the 3rd man. And that's not Edgar Vale, that's someone else entirely. Craddock looked closer. Could it be Henley? No, she said slowly. Look at the way he holds his hands. Not casual, formal, controlling. That man isn't a steward, he's a master. She carried the photo to the window, held it up to the light. In the background, half obscured by a shadowy hedge, was the corner of a signboard. Harrington and Partners, Surveying and Estate Law. Craddock's breath caught. Wait. Harrington? Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Not Lydia's father. He had no head for books. But her uncle, Charles Harrington, was a solicitor. He moved abroad before the war, or so the story went. Craddock sat down heavily. If that man is Charles Harrington and he stayed behind, changed his name, he could be the real architect. He'd have access to the Branksmere files, the land titles, the trust deeds. He could have used Henley to act on his behalf. And he could have posed as Davies, Miss Marple added. The letters, the false stationery. If he used that name, it would explain how Henley sourced the forged documents. The real Davies may have existed, but the letters we saw were not his. The pieces began to slide into place with a silent clarity. If Charles Harrington had never left England, if he had quietly adopted a new role, perhaps in a nearby firm or under an alias, he could have built an entire second life on the ruins of the Branksmere estate. George Broome had found the old ties in the ledgers, begun asking questions, and Henley, loyal or fearful, had done the rest. But now Henley was gone, and the pressure was mounting. The orchestrator might finally be growing desperate. Craddock immediately ordered a search of regional solicitor records and property deeds under any variation of the Harrington name. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned to the hall, requesting an audience with Lydia. She found her in the drawing room, staring blankly at the fire, a half-read book lying unopened in her lap. "I need to ask you something quite strange," Miss Marple began. "Do you recall if your father ever mentioned a brother who handled legal matters? One who disappeared or travelled abroad?" Lydia looked up, startled. "Uncle Charles. I thought he died in Africa. There were rumours he fell out with my grandfather over the estate." "Was there ever any proof of that?" "No," she admitted. "Only my father's word. But we never had a photograph of him. Odd, now I think about it. No obituary either." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I believe your uncle never left England. I believe he built a quiet life nearby, under a different name, and used his knowledge to control the trust from the shadows." Lydia sat straighter. "But that means everything we've built was built on a mission," Miss Marple said gently. "Not your fault, but the truth is surfacing now, and someone is trying very hard to shove it back down." That evening, Craddock received the report. A man named Colin Harris, aged in his 80s, residing in Cheltenham, had practiced estate law under limited contracts for nearly 4 decades. He matched the build of the man in the photo and had once shared an address with Charles Harrington in 1935. He had no children, no public records before 1946, and had kept out of village affairs entirely. Craddock and Miss Marple prepared to leave for Cheltenham at first light. But before they could depart, a call came through the station line. Henley's body had been found in a ditch 20 miles west, his car abandoned off a disused farm track. He had been struck from behind. No wallet, no papers, nothing taken but his briefcase. Craddock's face darkened. "The mastermind is cleaning house." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "And he's leaving fewer and fewer places to hide. But there's a pattern now, Inspector. Each silence, each body, follows one step closer to the truth, and that truth no longer rests on paper. It rests in memory, in connection, in motive." She looked again at the photo, then toward the window, where the wind had begun to rise, once more. The house of cards had begun to tremble, not from force but from exposure. And with each death, the last player standing was drawing nearer to the light he had evaded for a lifetime. The road to Cheltenham was long and twisting, the damp countryside fading into grey mist as the day wore on. Miss Marple sat quietly in the back of the car, her hands folded in her lap, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking together in her mind. Craddock sat at the wheel, his expression grim but resolute. Henley's body had been discovered only hours before, a grim reminder that they were dealing with a man who had no intention of going quietly. When they reached the small village just outside Cheltenham, Craddock and Miss Marple went straight to the local police station, where a sergeant met them with the latest developments. Henley's briefcase, found with his body, contained only one thing of importance, a letter from a solicitor named C.R. Davies, the same name that had appeared on the false documents, the one that had so conveniently slipped from their grasp. The letter was short, almost perfunctory, but it was enough to confirm that Henley had been more than just a pawn. He had been the final link in a long chain, a chain that started with Bernard Vale's manipulation of the Branksmere estate and led, ultimately, to the complete erasure of John Broome from history. But it wasn't just greed or power that had driven Henley to murder. It was fear, and something far darker. Miss Marple glanced over the letter, her expression soft but unyielding. "Fear," she muttered under her breath. "It's always fear, isn't it?" Craddock looked up from the letter, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Fear of exposure," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of years spent observing the human heart. But also something else. Henley was terrified of being seen, not for the truth of his actions, but for something more personal. They left the station and made their way to the address they had been given, an old, ivy-covered building that had once been a respectable legal office. The building was quiet now, abandoned. Yet the windows still carried the weight of time, as if someone had simply stopped caring, stopped watching. The door creaked open as Craddock pushed it, revealing an office frozen in the past, littered with yellowing files and dusty furniture. Miss Marple moved through the room slowly, her steps deliberate. She opened the top drawer of a large desk, and inside she found what she had been expecting, a series of old letters, personal, unmarked, written in a shaky hand. The letters weren't legal correspondence, but intimate confessions, written by Henley himself. One letter caught her eye. It was addressed to a woman. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top of the page was unmistakable. Lydia Harrington. "Miss Marple," Craddock asked, his voice tight with unease. "What have you found?" She glanced at him, holding up the letter for him to see. The truth. The letter was a confession, but it was more than that. It spoke of a deep, unrequited love that Henley had never been able to reveal, a love that had been buried beneath layers of deceit and fear. It wasn't just the Branksmere estate that Henley had manipulated. It was his own feelings for Lydia, feelings that had festered and twisted into something darker. In the letter, Henley admitted to keeping Lydia in the dark about the truth of her family's inheritance. He had always believed that, without her knowledge of her true heritage, she would never have to face the full extent of her family's sins. He had wanted to protect her, in his own way, by keeping her from the burden of the truth. But when George Broome had started to uncover the past, Henley had feared for Lydia's future, and for his own. He had feared that if she found out the truth, everything he had worked for, everything he had built, his quiet existence, his position at the Hall would be shattered. He would lose her, not because she had rejected him, but because the truth would make it impossible for them to ever have a future together. In the depths of his obsession, Henley had convinced himself that the only way to protect her was to erase George Broome and anyone else who might bring the past into the light. Miss Marple set the letter down carefully. "It wasn't about the estate," she said softly. "Not just that. It was about Henley's need to control Lydia's world, to keep her safe in the only way he knew, by keeping her ignorant. He loved her, in his own twisted way, and he was willing to destroy everything, her family, her history, anyone who stood in his way, because he believed the truth would break her." Craddock stared at the letter, the weight of its contents settling over him like a fog. But why kill Mrs. Vale? She didn't know anything that could hurt him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She knew too much. Mrs. Vale had started to remember things she hadn't thought about in years. She might have remembered something about Bernard Vale's involvement, or something about the will that wasn't meant to be found. Henley couldn't risk her speaking up. He killed her to keep the last loose end from unraveling. As they made their way back to the car, Craddock's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but the true horror of Henley's actions was only beginning to sink in. His motives were more complex than just power or revenge. Henley's crimes had been driven by fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being exposed, and most of all, fear of Lydia discovering the truth. His obsession had clouded his judgment, leading him to murder not for gain, but for a deluded sense of protection. Miss Marple turned to him as they drove through the rain-soaked streets. He thought he was protecting her, Inspector, but in the end, he only destroyed everything he tried to keep safe. Craddock glanced at her, the weight of her words settling in. And now we're left to pick up the pieces. We'll do what we can, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but certain. But remember, sometimes the greatest tragedies come not from the actions we take, but from the things we fail to understand. Henley couldn't see that, and neither could the people who came before him. They never realized that the truth was the only thing that could have set them free. Craddock nodded, his grip on the wheel tightening. They had uncovered the twisted roots of a crime that spanned generations. But now, the final question remained. Would they be able to stop Henley before he struck again? Or would the past, with all its tangled lies and lost loves, claim yet another victim? The rain had not let up since the evening Henley's body was discovered, a relentless downpour that seemed to seep into the very bones of the village. Yet, as they made their way to Cheltenham, Miss Marple sat composed, as always, her sharp eyes following the changing landscape with a quiet intensity. Craddock, on the other hand, was increasingly uneasy. The realization that they were now close to confronting the true mastermind of everything weighing on him. Henley had acted out of fear of exposure, fear of losing the one thing he had fought to protect. But Henley was not the source of the darkness that had clouded Lidcombe Parva for decades. The true orchestrator had been hiding in plain sight all along. When they arrived at the address provided by the solicitor's office, a run-down building on a quiet street in Cheltenham, Miss Marple wasted no time. They entered, the door creaking, open to reveal an aging office space cluttered with yellowing paperwork and the musty smell of forgotten time. On the desk sat a few unopened letters, a half-empty glass of water, and a stack of legal contracts. Nothing about the space suggested urgency, yet everything about it spoke of a life carefully maintained, a life designed to withstand scrutiny, a life built on secrets. Craddock moved to the desk, scanning the papers. Miss Marple's eyes were already on the far corner, where a faded photograph hung crookedly on the wall. It was an old family portrait, the edges curling with age. Two men, one younger and one older, stood side by side in front of a house. Clearly, a different time, a different world. The older man was Bernard Vale. The younger man had to be Charles Harrington. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the photograph, her lips pressed tightly together. "He's here, Inspector," she said quietly, as if she had already known. Charles Harrington. He was never out of the picture. Craddock turned, his eyes widening slightly. "You mean to tell me he's been here all along?" "I do," Miss Marple said, "and I think he's waiting for us." The tension in the room was palpable, thickening with each passing second. Craddock moved to the desk and rifled through the papers. Beneath the legal contracts, he found a small, leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. A ledger. He opened it carefully, scanning the names, the figures, an accounting of years of illicit transactions, names crossed out, and payments that had been funneled through multiple shell companies. But then, at the very end of the ledger, there it was, H.B. Ledgerwell, the name they had seen before, and beside it an entry marked simply Lydia Harrington, payment completed. The last transaction was dated only a few weeks ago. Craddock's heart pounded in his chest. He was bribing Lydia, trying to get her to sell the land, to relinquish everything. This wasn't just about George Broome. It was about him too. The only thing standing between him and control of the Branksmere estate was Lydia, and he was willing to do whatever it took to remove that barrier. "Which includes murder," Miss Marple added. More than one. He never planned to stop. At that moment, the door opened slowly. Charles Harrington stood in the doorway, his face pale but composed. His eyes were cold, calculating. A man who had long ago learned how to mask his emotions. But there was a tremor in his hands. Miss Marple had been right. He had been waiting for them. "I wondered when you would figure it out," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "But it doesn't matter. You're too late." Craddock stepped forward, his voice steady. "Too late. It's never too late, Harrington. You've run your game for too long. But now it ends. You're the one who's been manipulating everything, the records, the estate, Lydia. You've killed, lied, and covered your tracks. All for a piece of land that's never truly been yours." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm afraid of you, Inspector? Or of her?" He gestured toward Miss Marple. "You're both far too late. The truth is buried. There's no evidence left to find. You have nothing to hold against me." "Except your own confession," Miss Marple said quietly, stepping forward. "The letters you've been writing, the ones to Henley, you wrote them all, didn't you? You convinced him to erase the records, to keep Lydia in the dark. You let him believe you were protecting her, when all you were really doing was protecting yourself." Harrington's face twisted, a flicker of panic crossing his features. "You're wrong. It's not what you think." Miss Marple's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the power in it. "You've been hiding behind a mask. For so long, Charles, a mask of respectability, a mask of authority, but it's all been a lie. You've been hiding from your own guilt, hiding from the truth about what you did to your brother's family, hiding from the truth about who you really are." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Charles Harrington's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Craddock thought he might lash out. But instead, Harrington took a step back, his face contorting with frustration. "You don't understand. I had no choice. It was the only way." "Had no choice?" Craddock asked, his voice rising. "You killed for land, for power. You destroyed people's lives, their histories. All for what? So you could keep your inheritance?" Harrington's shoulders slumped slightly. "I was never supposed to inherit it, you know. My brother was the heir, but after he died, after he disappeared, it all fell to me. But I couldn't let it go to anyone else. I needed it. All of it." Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on him. "And when you saw Lydia about to discover the truth, you made sure she wouldn't. You manipulated her. You manipulated Henley. You destroyed anyone who could get in your way." Harrington's eyes darted toward the door, his mind calculating the escape routes. He had no intention of confessing. He had no intention of allowing his web to unravel. He'd always been several steps ahead. But Miss Marple had anticipated that. "Don't bother," she said, almost as if reading his mind. "You're not going anywhere." Craddock moved toward the phone, his hand hovering over the receiver. Harrington, sensing his impending doom, made a final, desperate move. He lunged toward the door. But before he could reach it, Miss Marple stepped aside, and the sound of approaching sirens filled the room. Harrington froze, then turned toward them, his face betraying a mix of rage and fear. "You'll never prove it. You can't." "We don't need to," Craddock said. "You already did it yourself." As the officers closed in, Miss Marple looked at Harrington one last time, her gaze steady and resolute. "You wanted control. You wanted everything, Charles. But you didn't realize that the one thing you couldn't control was the truth. It always has a way of finding its way out." The weight of his actions settled around him. And for the first time, Charles Harrington seemed to understand. His empire of lies was finally crumbling, and he couldn't escape it. The past, with all its shadows and secrets, had caught up with him, and now it was over. As they left the office, Craddock glanced at Miss Marple. "You were right all along. The truth always has a way of coming to light." She nodded, her eyes calm, but with a deep knowing. And sometimes the hardest thing is not finding the truth, but accepting it. The case had come full circle. The villain had been unmasked, but the cost had been high, and Lidcombe Parva, for all its quiet corners and shadowed past, would never be the same again. The days following Charles Harrington's arrest had been quiet. The storm that had raged over Lidcombe Parva for so long seemed to have passed, leaving behind only the gentle hum of a village still coming to terms with what had transpired. The news spread quickly, and soon Lydia Harrington was able to breathe. Again, her inheritance secured, the truth about her family's past brought to light. The Branksmere estate would go on, but it would never be the same. Craddock was busy tying up loose ends, final reports, interviews, paperwork. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her quiet life, though she hadn't entirely left the investigation behind. She spent her mornings knitting by the fire, her afternoons reading the local papers, and her evenings were usually spent listening to the echoes of a case that had never really settled in her mind. There was something about the way everything had come together so neatly that didn't sit quite right with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had been overlooked, something important. It was just as she was sipping her tea on the morning of the third day after the arrest that she received a call from Craddock. His voice was strained, different from his usual calm. "Miss Marple, I need you to come to the station. There's been a development. We may have missed something." Within the hour she was at the station, and Craddock met her at the door, his face pale and drawn. "It's about Henley." "Henley?" Miss Marple repeated, her brow furrowing. "But he's dead. You said he was found in that ditch. We've all moved on from that." Craddock nodded, but there was an air of unease in him that Miss Marple recognized all too well. "It's not Henley. At least not exactly. We've been going over the evidence again, double-checking everything. And then we found something. A mistake. A detail that doesn't add up." He handed her a file, and as she flipped it open, she saw it immediately. A report detailing Henley's disappearance and subsequent death. But beneath the official statements, there was something new. An autopsy report that had just come through, overlooked until now. The report didn't match what they had previously believed. Henley's injuries were consistent with a blow from behind, yes, but there was more. The report noted that there had been an unusual chemical trace found in his bloodstream, something not present in normal conditions. A toxic substance, something quite rare. And then there was the cause of death. It wasn't the head injury. Henley had died from poisoning. Craddock's face was grim as he watched Miss Marple absorb the information. He didn't die by the ditch. Someone made sure he was dead before they dumped his body. Miss Marple's mind was already turning, recalling every conversation, every moment that had led them to this point. It was too neat, too perfect. Charles Harrington had been the obvious culprit. He had been so eager to cover his tracks. But Henley had been a necessary part of that plan. His death, his confession, everything had played into Harrington's hands, or so they thought. "And now we know," Miss Marple said quietly, setting the file down, "that we were wrong. Harrington didn't act alone. Someone else was pulling the strings, and they didn't stop with Henley." Craddock nodded, his frustration palpable. "But who?" Henley was loyal to Harrington. He followed his every command. Why would anyone want to kill him, and why would they make sure the evidence was covered up so perfectly? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, her thoughts working through the tangled web one last time. "There's someone we haven't looked at closely enough, Inspector. Someone who has been hiding in plain sight all along. Someone who benefited just as much as Harrington from Henley's actions. Who? Craddock's voice was low, hesitant, as if the realization had just begun to form in his mind. Mrs. Vale, Miss Marple said quietly. Craddock blinked, taken aback. Mrs. Vale. But she was murdered. You saw it yourself. She was killed by Henley. Wasn't she? Or so we thought, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. But what if she wasn't? What if Mrs. Vale wasn't killed by Henley, but by someone who wanted to keep her quiet? Someone who knew that Mrs. Vale had begun to remember things. She might have known something about Bernard Vale's involvement that Henley had never wanted. Exposed. But what if she knew more about him than we realized? Craddock stared at her, the pieces starting to fall into place. You're saying Mrs. Vale knew something about Charles Harrington? She knew something about the land, about the estate that Henley didn't want her to reveal. Exactly, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but urgent. Mrs. Vale was the last person to know about Bernard Vale's involvement with the Branksmere estate. She was the one who could have uncovered the final truth about Charles Harrington's role. But Henley, he wasn't the only one trying to keep that secret buried. Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing with understanding. I think I know exactly who was behind Henley's death, and I think they're still hiding, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Craddock looked at her, confusion giving way to understanding. You mean Mrs. Vale's brother? Yes, Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp. Edgar Vale. He wasn't just a steward. He was the key. He knew the whole story. And I think he's been using Charles Harrington as a shield, covering for him all these years. He helped cover up John Broom's death, and he helped cover up Bernard Vale's fraud. Edgar Vale was the one who made sure that Henley didn't talk, and now he's trying to make sure we don't piece it all together. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression hardening with resolve. Then it's time we bring Edgar Vale in. We're not letting him get away with this any longer. But just as they began to make plans to head to the Vale estate, the phone rang. The sergeant on the other end was out of breath. Inspector Craddock, we've got trouble. Edgar Vale is dead. Someone strangled him. And we found a letter, addressed, To you, Miss Marple. The room went still. Miss Marple's face was unreadable as she looked at Craddock, her hands suddenly cold. It's not over, is it? She said softly. Craddock shook his head. No, it's just beginning. Miss Marple stepped back, collecting herself. We need to act quickly. Edgar Vale may have been a man hiding the truth, but now he's gone. The last piece has fallen into place, Inspector. The final piece of the puzzle. With a deep breath, Craddock picked up the phone, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. We're not done yet, Miss Marple. Not by a long shot. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained heavy, a dim grey that seemed to mirror the weight of what had happened in Lidcombe Parva. Miss Marple sat at the station, her hands folded in her lap as Craddock paced back and forth, his thoughts a whirlwind of frustration and uncertainty. Edgar Vale was dead. The man who had quietly manipulated so many lives, buried so many truths, had been strangled in his own home, the letter addressed to Miss Marple left behind on the desk. The revelation had thrown the case into chaos. Edgar Vale's death had been the final twist, the last play in a game no one had fully understood until it was too late. Craddock's voice broke the silence. He was here. Edgar Vale knew we were. Close. He must have known we were unraveling everything. The letter to you, Miss Marple. He was warning us or taunting us. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, her mind piecing together the fragments they had collected. I don't think he was taunting us. I think he was trying to cover his tracks. He wasn't just hiding the truth about the estate, he was hiding himself. And now that he's gone, we're left with only the aftermath, the consequences of his actions. Craddock stopped pacing, his brow furrowed. But why kill him now? Why not just stay hidden like he did all these years? Why come out of the shadows? Miss Marple looked at him, her eyes sharp. Because he knew we were too close. He knew that once we found the last piece of the puzzle, Henley's poisoning, his connection to Charles Harrington, and the land fraud, he would have nowhere left to hide. He had to act before we connected the final dots. Craddock clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. But now the truth is out. Henley's dead, Edgar's dead, and Harrington, he's already been arrested. Justice has been served. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. Not entirely. You see, the truth is never as simple as it appears. And justice is a much more elusive thing than you might think. Craddock looked at her, confusion evident on his face. What do you mean? Harrington's in custody. We have the confession, the evidence. No, Miss Marple interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. We don't. What we have is a series of conclusions we've drawn from the pieces of evidence we found. But we've missed something vital, Inspector. Something that has been hiding in plain sight all along. Craddock leaned in, his attention fixed on her. What have we missed? The letter, Miss Marple said, pointing to the desk where the letter from Edgar Vale had been placed. The one addressed to me. Craddock looked at the letter, then back at her. But that's just a final attempt at manipulating the investigation. A last-ditch effort to throw us off. Miss Marple shook her head again. No, it's more than that. It's a clue, one we overlooked because we were too focused on the obvious suspects. She took the letter, unfolded it carefully, and began reading aloud. Miss Marple, I know you are close to the truth. You may have already uncovered the web of lies that I have spent my life weaving, but there are still pieces you do not see. The game is not over, not yet. There is someone else who has been pulling the strings all along. Someone who has been watching us all, waiting for the moment when the truth would slip through the cracks. Be careful who you trust, for the greatest danger lies in plain sight. I have kept my secrets, but not all of them are mine to keep. Edgar Vale. Craddock's face paled as the meaning sank in. You're saying? Miss Marple nodded. I'm saying Edgar Vale didn't act alone, and neither did Charles Harrington. The mastermind, the real mastermind, was someone we've all overlooked. Someone who has been hiding in the shadows all along, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Craddock's voice dropped to a whisper. Who? Who could it be? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Think about it, Inspector. Who stands to gain the most from this entire affair? Who had the power to manipulate both Harrington and Vale to control everything from the shadows? The answer has been in front of us the entire time. Craddock was silent for a moment, the realization dawning slowly. Lydia. You're saying Lydia Harrington? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Lydia. She's been the key all along, but not in the way we thought. She wasn't just the victim of these schemes. She was the architect of them. Craddock's mind raced, trying to process the new information. But she's been so innocent, so naive. How could she have orchestrated all of this? Miss Marple stood, her movements slow and deliberate. Lydia's innocence was the perfect cover. She used her vulnerability, her position as the last heir to the Branksmere estate, to manipulate everyone around her. Charles Harrington, Edgar Vale, even Henley, all of them were pawns in her game. She let them believe they were in control, but in reality she was the one pulling the strings. Craddock's voice shook with disbelief. But why? Why would she do all of this? For money? Power? No, Miss Marple said, her voice softening. For love, for her father's love, for the love she thought she could never have. Paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Lydia has spent her entire life being overshadowed by her family's legacy. Her father's absence, her uncle's betrayal, her brother's distant memory, they all left her with a hunger for something more. And when she saw an opportunity to control the inheritance, to claim her place in the family story, she took it. Craddock's mind was reeling. But how? How did she manipulate everyone? How did she get Henley to do her bidding? Miss Marple looked at him, her eyes cold with understanding. Lydia didn't need to manipulate Henley directly. She didn't need to. She simply made him believe that his loyalty to her was the key to his survival. She used his fear of exposure, his need to be in control, and his twisted obsession with protecting her to turn him into her weapon. He killed for her, just as Edgar Vale had, just as Charles Harrington had, all for the same thing, a seat at the table, a piece of the legacy. Craddock's breath caught in his throat. And the murders? Mrs. Vale, Henley, Miss Marple sighed. They were obstacles, people who might have exposed her before she could secure everything. Mrs. Vale knew too much, and Henley, well, he was her final step. He had to be removed to ensure that nothing would stand in her way. A long silence passed between them. Craddock stood frozen, his mind trying to catch up with the revelation. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with disbelief. But she's not just a criminal, she's a mastermind. She's been playing us all along. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, and now we have to stop her before she takes her final step, before she disappears entirely, leaving us to clean up the wreckage. They left the station immediately, knowing that Lydia would not give up easily. She was clever, dangerous, and now fully aware that her game had been exposed. As they made their way to Ashgrove Hall once more, Craddock couldn't shake the feeling that Lydia was one step ahead of them, always just out of reach, always ready to make her final move. The truth had been revealed, but at what cost? The drive back to Lidcombe Parva was silent, the weight of the revelation still hanging heavy in the air. Craddock sat at the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, while Miss Marple stared out the window, her mind still turning over the events of the past weeks. Lydia Harrington, the woman who had once seemed so innocent, so vulnerable, had orchestrated everything, manipulating people, deceiving everyone, all in the name of control. The puzzle was solved, the villain exposed, but the finality of it left a hollow feeling in the pit of Miss Marple's stomach. The village, once so serene, now felt different. The churchyard, which had been the silent witness to so many secrets, seemed somehow darker, as if the weight of the truth had shifted the very air. Craddock's phone buzzed as they passed through the village gates. Another update, another piece of the puzzle. But Miss Marple wasn't interested in the details anymore. She had already solved it. The rest, as far as she was concerned, was just noise. As they parked outside the station, she turned to Craddock. "It's over now, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft, almost wistful. Craddock paused for a moment before replying, his face taut with exhaustion. "It should be over. But something feels off, doesn't it? There's something about the way everything fell into place too easily. Like we're missing something. Or someone." Miss Marple looked out the window again, her fingers drumming lightly on her knee. "You're right, Inspector. I've been feeling the same way. It's as if the story isn't quite finished. We've uncovered everything on the surface, but there's always something lurking beneath." Craddock frowned. "You mean there's more? Another twist?" "Perhaps not a twist, but a lingering question. A detail we missed. Or perhaps one we weren't meant to see. A hidden message that's been staring us in the face the entire time." She turned to him, her eyes sharp. "You remember the letter from Edgar Vale? The one he wrote before his death?" Craddock nodded, his brow furrowing. "The one that said the game wasn't over. The one that warned us there was someone else still in the shadows." Miss Marple's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Exactly. And yet, we haven't found that someone else, have we? We've uncovered all the players in this game. Henley, Lydia, Edgar, even Bernard Vale. But there's something about that letter, something about how it was worded, that doesn't sit right with me. Craddock leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? Edgar's letter said the game wasn't over, that there was someone else waiting for the truth to slip through the cracks. But when we confronted Lydia, we found no one else. She was the mastermind, so why would Edgar mention another player at all? Craddock looked at her, trying to process the implications. You think Edgar was warning us about someone we haven't even considered? I'm not sure, Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. But I know one thing for certain, we've been looking at the wrong end of the puzzle. There's a piece we've overlooked, and it's right in front of us. Just as Craddock was about to respond, the station door opened, and Sergeant Blake appeared, holding a small envelope. Inspector, Miss Marple, you'll want to see this, he said, handing the envelope to Craddock. Craddock tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. It's from Edgar Vale's solicitor, he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. It's a final statement. It says, there's another will, one that wasn't filed with the Branksmere estate. It names a new beneficiary. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as Craddock continued reading. It's addressed to Lydia Harrington, he said, looking up, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. And it's dated just a few days before his death. It states that Edgar Vale, before his confession to the police, had signed over all his remaining interest in the estate to someone else. Not Lydia, not Charles Harrington, but someone who had remained in the shadows. Craddock's words hung in the air like a trap. Miss Marple's mind raced, her thoughts trying to process the meaning behind Edgar's final statement. Who is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Craddock looked at her, his eyes wide with realization. It's Henley. The will was transferred to him before his death. Miss Marple's face went pale. But that doesn't make sense. Henley was the one we thought was working for Lydia. Why would he... Craddock's face hardened. Because he wasn't just working for her. He was working for someone else, someone who was still pulling the strings, someone who never intended for Lydia to inherit the estate. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place, the pieces falling into the gaps that had previously eluded her. Edgar Vale, before he died, knew that Charles Harrington was no longer in control. Henley was the true heir, and all along, Lydia had been the pawn. Craddock looked at her, stunned. So Henley was the real mastermind after all. Not Charles Harrington, not Lydia. Henley. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind still, turning over the implications. It was never about the estate, it was about control. Henley wasn't just protecting Lydia. He was protecting his own claim to the legacy. He was the one who had known the truth all along, about the fraud, the cover-up, the land. And when Lydia began to uncover that truth, he killed to protect it. But in doing so, he sealed his own fate. Craddock stood, pacing again, his hand running through his hair. But if Henley was the true heir, then why did he set up Lydia to take the fall? Why did he make sure we'd focus on her? Because Henley was playing the long game, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but firm. He knew he had to eliminate everyone else. But he also knew that if Lydia believed she was in control, she would make the right decisions. He needed her to follow the path he had laid out for her, to keep her safe while he did the dirty work in the background. As Craddock turned, ready to make the next move, Miss Marple added, and that's why the truth never fully came to light. Because Henley had built his house of cards with the perfect misdirection. And even though we've solved the case, there's one final question left unanswered. Craddock stopped in his tracks, a deep unease in his gut. What question? Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on him, calm but intense. Why did Henley leave the letter for us to find? Why did he make sure we knew his plan? Craddock looked at her, his stomach dropping. You think he wanted us to find it? Miss Marple nodded slowly. I think Henley knew that in the end, the only way to truly protect the legacy was for us to understand what had happened. The case was never really about justice, Inspector. It was about control. And Henley, in his final moments, had to make sure his story was told. As Craddock turned to leave, ready to follow this new lead, Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts lingering on the unsettling truth they had uncovered. The case had been solved. But something still lingered in the shadows, something that didn't quite fit. And as they moved forward, one thing was certain. In a world built on deception and half-truths, there was always one more puzzle to solve.